Welcome to the first of two Component 1 screencasts on the news media. And this is the third topic of the Component 1 mass media unit. Now the news media is obviously selective because the mass media obviously cannot report all of the events and issues happening every day in the world. And this means that rather than simply being out there waiting to be collected, what counts as the news is necessarily selected and processed, or to use the sociological jargon, socially constructed by a range of social influences. And in this screencast, we're going to have a look at how the content of the news media is actually selected. So over the course of the next two screencasts, we're going to look at a range of different social factors that affect the content of the news. So we're going to be considering some of the main things that influence the selection, production and packaging of this media product that we call the news. And in this particular screencast, we're going to focus on some of the factors that are external to the newsroom itself. We're going to look at the owners and their influence, and also the influence of advertisers. And then in the second screencast, we start to look at some of the factors that influence the news inside the newsroom itself. So we'll look at the role of journalists and also the organisational constraints that journalists have to work under. Now hopefully you'll remember from the previous screencast on the ownership and control of the mass media that the guy that we can see here is Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch is one of the key owners of News Corporation, which is this giant global media conglomerate that owns a lot of news media all around the world, including the Sun newspaper and the Times within a UK context. And as we saw in previous screencasts, the traditional Marxist perspective would place a great deal of emphasis on the influence of media owners such as Rupert Murdoch. And journalists and editors who've worked for Rupert Murdoch in the past have admitted that sometimes on issues that Murdoch believes are particularly important, he will impose his views on his editors. And one issue that was important to Rupert Murdoch in the early part of 2003 was the Iraq War. And what you can see on this particular slide is a rally being held in Hyde Park at the end of a march against the Iraq War. And this demonstration that involved anywhere between 1 million and 2 million people is actually the biggest demonstration that we've ever seen within the UK. However, despite the fact that there was a lot of opposition to the Iraq War around the world, every single newspaper that Rupert Murdoch owned in 2003, so all 175 newspapers that he owned around the world, backed the US and UK invasion of Iraq. And many people would infer from this that Rupert Murdoch probably told his editors the line that they had to adopt in relation to this important but contentious issue. And even when owners don't directly impose their own views, it's unlikely that those who work for them will, if they want to keep their jobs, produce stories that actively oppose their owners' prejudices and interests. And the political leanings of many newspaper owners tend to be conservative and right-wing. Okay, let's have a look at the second key influence on the content of the news, and that's the role of advertisers. Now, the news media are predominantly run by large business corporations who have the aim of making money, of delivering a profit for their owners. And the source of much of this profit is advertising, and it's this dependence on advertising that explains why so much concern is expressed about newspaper circulation or ratings for television programs. And advertisers will usually advertise only if they know that there is a large audience for their advertisements, or if the audience is small, the audience needs to be relatively well off and likely to buy their products or services. And there's some evidence that sometimes advertisers will directly interfere with newspaper content. So a 1992 US study of 150 news editors found that 90% said that advertisers had tried to interfere with newspaper content, and 70% tried to stop certain news stories altogether. And 40% of these news editors admitted that advertisers had in fact influenced a story that they published. And because the core business of the commercial media is to sell audiences to advertisers, this inevitably means that what becomes the news is partly a result of these commercial pressures to attract audiences. And this might lead to a distortion of the news. This might lead to a concentration on sensational stories, on gossip and scandal, which are more likely to attract a mass audience than more serious news issues are. And Nick Davis, in his recent book Flat Earth News, claims that the private ownership of news media organisations has made profit become the most important motivator for the press today. And as a result of this, newspapers in particular are full of stories that are interesting to the public rather than stories that are actually in the public interest. So a lot of newspapers are full of gossip, trivia, scandal, and sometimes sociologists might use the term infotainment to describe this kind of mix of entertainment and information which now often passes for news. So in this first screencast, we really focused on some of the kind of external pressures on journalists when they're producing the news, the pressures that come from their owners or the pressure that comes from advertisers. What we do in the next screencast is we actually go into the newsroom and we actually look at the role of the journalists themselves and also look at the organisational constraints that journalists have to work under that might affect the production of news.